All right, so as Lance said, I'm Andy, and this is joint with Dean Corbet here in the audience. And this is both more macro than the morning sessions and has relatively little human capital in its current state. But you guys will see there's a part where maybe that could be enriched. And so it'd be great to get comments on that part specifically. The main thing that this is going to be about is an interaction between labor markets and credit markets, and how a very relevant current policy wave interacts with that. Okay, so the thing that we're going to study in this paper is how employer credit checks work in the labor market and what we can expect to happen as more states ban the practice. So just to give you a little background in case you haven't heard about this, many of us don't really work in jobs where we probably have to face it, but over the past 15 to 20 years, it's become a really hot button issue, and that is employers asking their job applicants if they can check their credit report. Okay, so the same way that when you apply for a loan, they might run your Equifax credit report and look and see all your delinquencies and all your, if you've ever filed for bankruptcy, any of that stuff, they can do this when you apply for a job. And in 2009, which for various reasons was sort of the height of this practice, 60% of human resource representatives who were surveyed by this professional society, the Society for Human Resource Management, reported using credit checks on at least some of their job applicants. Okay, and while there's no sort of national representative data on who has been affected in the labor market by these credit checks, Demos, which is a policy think tank, did a survey and they found that 1 in 7 low to mid-income workers said that they were actually denied a job because something on their credit report. Okay, so this got people really worked up and really worried, and say state legislators really worried, and even some federal legislators. And so in response, since 2006 or so, we've seen a wave of legislation either proposed or even passed that restricts, and I'll say ban just to have a short term, bans the practice of an employer checking the credit report of a job applicant. And if you read the legislators' rationale for these policies, this is sort of a typical narrative that you would get. So Massachusetts, at this point, does not have one of these bans, but I would say they're a very likely state to ban in the near-term future. And so one of their state legislators, Barrett here, says, we want people who have bad credit to get good jobs, so that they're able to pay their bills and get the bad credit removed. The idea here is that this can create a cycle where you have bad credit, you can't find a job, which means you can't improve your credit, which you can't find a job, and so on and so forth. So they have this poverty trap logic in mind when they've passed these laws. And you can read a lot of these sort of quotes, and they all have a similar flavor to this. Okay? And so this is going to be a very quantitative, yep.
So what is it about the credit reports that employers may be looking at? Is it a bankruptcy? Is it a flag? Is it the amount of credit?
When they ask for it, it's a specific product sold by the big three reporting agencies. So it's not exactly the same thing as a bank would see, but it will have negative outcomes, so delinquencies, defaults. The age of your credit lines, when you defaulted, things like that. So it'll have that information. It does not actually literally have the credit score, this thing that you get when you sign on to your credit card company, but it has all the information that you could use to create something like a prior of the.
But is this occupation specific? I mean, so if I'm a manual laborer, we're digging a ditch. Who cares if I'm picking apples in an orchard? I mean. So what if I have bad credit? I just need to be able to pick my apples that day, right? So I don't know why these things are tied.
Why do they care?
No, why do they use the credit reports? So what's the logic in terms of the economic? What's the benefit to the employer?
So if you talk to employers, they'll often say things like, we want to try to get a better assessment of someone's responsibility. So the idea is,
test.
sorry?
It's a character test.
Yeah, a character test, or it could be that they're, I mean, I guess a lot of things could be correlated with things like patience. That's how we're actually going to model it. And so that could be just a reduced form way of getting at some otherwise unobservable component of revenue productivity that the firm cares about. So it might be that somebody who's more patient pays their credit down and doesn't default, and they're more likely to show up on time. So it could be a number of things. We're kind of going to be silent and just build it into the model so that they're more productive.
There are certain attributes that may be relevant for some jobs, and this one seems like it might be relevant for some. It'd just be interesting to cut the data to see.
So let me show you this. So as a way of kind of motivating what we're going to build into the model and the kind of policy responses we're going to get out, let me show you some results of a paper I have with Cortez and Tashi. That's purely doing this, cutting up the data to the best that we can. And so what we've been able to do is, because since the mid-2000s, and especially during the Great Recession, a lot of states passed these laws that restrict the ability for employers to check the credit. But they make exemptions for people who are going to handle cash or Social Security numbers, things where you would think somebody who was had a lot of debt might have a moral hazard problem. Okay, and so what we were able to do for labor markets is essentially run a diff and diff, looking at the change in vacancies in counties of states that passed the ban, based on the occupation of those vacancies. And so these are just showing the event plots. So before period 0, when the state gets the ban enacted, neither exempt or affected occupations have any difference between states that don't have the ban. Then once the ban goes into place, we see a decline in vacancies in the occupations where the ban actually has bite, and essentially no movement at all in the exempt. Okay, so
can you elaborate as well on, because there used to be, maybe there still are these the drug checks, also as a way of a character testing?
Sorry, the what?
Drug testing.
Drug testing.
And was that affected as part of the reform?
So the real big push for ban the box and other things like that has sort of been at the same time as this, but we checked for the states that we were using, and we didn't see any legislation at that level that banned other types of checks. Now, it is true, like if you're going to use like New York City, they banned both the box and employer credit checks at the same time. But the state level ones, we didn't see that. So we don't think it's that confounding, that we're getting that confounding. Okay.
Andy, so I know this isn't the paper you want to talk about, but do you know if there's any shifting of job titles away from non-exempt to exempt?
We haven't tested for that. We tested for things like whether we could see changes in the education of the things, but we didn't see anything like that. So we haven't tested specifically for that. That's a good idea. I don't know if we could actually, but I'll check on that. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, and so this is something that is very much in line with what we're going to build into this structural model today, because we're going to have a labor market where the effect of the ban is going to come through labor demand. And, well, of course, vacancies aren't literally, textbook labor demand. It is the thing that firms have direct control over, and they can respond with when bans go into place.
Is there some sort of mechanical relationship between a vacancy and a background check or a credit check?
What do you mean?
So you can hire multiple jobs based on the same vacancy. Like the notion of what a vacancy is and what it results in terms of actual jobs created is variable. And I'm wondering whether if you want to do is there some sort of mechanical reason for why, if you want to use credit checks, that now you have to behave differently in terms of the vacancies behind your credit check?
You know, I don't know if we could answer that with the data that we have. I'm not actually 100% sure I'm following.
In some cases, you are required institutionally to attach one vacancy to each position that you're trying to fill. In some cases, you can blanket say, we are hiring all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, apply, and that single vacancy is the foundation for tens and hundreds of jobs. And so I'm wondering to what extent are you required to suddenly make a one-to-one mapping between your jobs and your vacancies, and how is that related to the use of these
I see.
background checks?
So I think if anything that would make
the legislation somehow affect that relationship?
So let me. I think I can answer that two ways. So first, the graphs I'm showing you here are just the total vacancies at the county level. We did it on new vacancies as well. So it seems like both types, to the extent that we can get at them, have a similar decline. The other thing I would say is that if you thought that the inability to check credit made it where you needed to bring more people in for interviews to get some signal about their ability to take the job, or made it harder to fill a vacancy, I guess I would expect it to have the opposite effect here. I guess I would expect it to, if anything, if it was that mechanical relationship, I would have expected a rise in the vacancies that are outstanding rather than a decline. That's the best I can kind of reason through that on my feet. Okay, and so then another thing that we saw here, and this again will be a central part of what comes out of this structural model, is that you can imagine there's a spillover due to this policy from the labor market to the credit market. Either you can think that people were internalizing the effect that their bad behavior in credit markets would have on their future job finding prospects, and then when they know that that's no longer something they have to worry about, at the margin they may be less likely to repay their debts on time, they may be more delinquent on more payments, or they can't find jobs and therefore they can't pay. Either way, you might expect an increase in delinquency, sort of a negative effect in credit markets, even though this policy is literally only directly affecting labor markets. And so this is another graph that we have from the data, but we'll have also here in the model, is the share of, this should be share of accounts delinquent, again, for borrowers who are in counties with the law and borrowers who are in counties without the law, relative to borrowers in counties without the law. And again, we don't really see any difference between these types of borrowers before the ban, and then we start to see a rise in delinquencies for borrowers in ban counties after the law goes into effect. Okay, so we're going to have both of these things happening in the model. We're going to have a general equilibrium in the labor market with private information about some unobservable component of a worker's productivity. It's going to be correlated with their credit market behavior, and so credit scores are going to be informative about it. When we hit the model with a ban of employer credit checks, we're going to see an effect on labor markets and on credit markets.
So there's lots of stories that could explain this.
Okay.
So one is moral hazard. People go delinquent when they don't pay the penalty. One is movers. So those movers. So you move from one county to another because the new county has one of these ban-the-box policies. I'm wondering if there's also some kind of endogeneity here. So a county knows they're going to be facing a shock in the next period, so let's ban the box now so that workers have a good shot moving forward.
Yeah, I guess This is the other paper, so let's talk about this later, okay? But I think some of that would have pre-trend effects that we're not seeing, but we'll talk about it later, okay? So you can think about it as we want to take a model that has these features and use it to say, okay, well, who's going to gain and who's going to lose when we ban employer credit checks, okay? So again, here's the model mechanism in case you just tune out during the, I will omit loads of structure that we have in this model, okay? So you can think of this as like it's a model of labor search in which households use short-term credit in order to consume and smooth out consumption, and are heterogeneous ex ante in terms of how patient they are. Okay, and firms are going to use this information from your history of defaults to try to infer some residual part of your productivity that's not directly observable, at least ex ante, before you've worked for the firm for some amount of time. Okay, so up until you meet, I don't know how productive you are. You start producing, I do, but I might still want to signal before I undertake the expense of hiring you. And so low productivity workers are going to be more likely to default because of this discount factor difference, which we borrow this modeling choice from Chatterjee, Corbet, and Rios rule. And when they default, they get a flag on their credit report. Furthermore, patient workers, and this is where the human capital is in the model and could be enriched, I expect. Patient workers invest more at the beginning of their lives in some unobservable human capital. Okay, it's going to be a cost that they bear at that point, and they're going to accrue benefits from it throughout their life, but they're going to discount those benefits heterogeneously because of their difference in patiences.
So here, I guess is it important that it's like an effort, direct utility cost rather than sort of in dollars? Because in dollars they would just smooth it out, and the grid time preference wouldn't matter. Or their credit frictions, because of these credit frictions, actually that would matter as well.
Yeah, if you had credit frictions at the point where they had to make the dollar investment, for sure. I can't say for sure if there weren't credit frictions at that point. We're going to do it in utils just because it makes it easier. It's like you have to study hard. Yeah. Okay. And so this is how we're going to create in equilibrium a positive correlation between credit score and productivity. And this is why firms are going to care about the credit score, because it's going to be informative about something that's otherwise unobservable, even if the job doesn't sound like it necessarily requires somebody with good credit.
And should I think about workers as being heterogeneous in two dimensions here, or there's a one-dimensional workers where I go from low productivity and impatient to high productivity and impatient?
Ex post people will be heterogeneous both in their labor productivity and in their patience.
Oh, I see.
Because they're going to make this choice, this investment choice. But that's going to be driven by the patients. Yeah.
Is this all about hiring? This is like the initial hire. I mean,
yep.
Presumably these characteristics are also relevant for keeping the person on the job and termination and so forth. So I'm just wondering if you looked over the whole career, whether or not you would find similar effects. I mean, I don't know if you're modeling it here or not, but I mean,
yeah,
so about human capital growth and productivity. Presumably the employer would learn about it, right? And that productivity would matter. I think, or in some firms.
I'll show. I mean, I think it'll be very clear, but I can answer that in one sentence. For convenience, your productivity is going to be observed immediately after being hired by the firm. So the only direct effect of your credit history on your labor market will come from this initial screening at the point of being hired. Now, because we have bargaining...
So then ex post, then this credit history should have no effect whatsoever. And subsequent, layoffs and so forth, right?
So, no, there's bargaining. So bargaining, your credit history determines the surplus of the match and your threat point. So it will, in fact, have an effect even after I know your type, because it's going to affect your ability to say, hey, I'll walk away from this job. Yeah. But if it wasn't for the bargaining, you'd be exactly right. Okay. Okay. And so what we're going to have here is we're going to actually have a model where we get in equilibrium the type of thing that the policymakers were worried about. We are going to have people for whom we can say there is a poverty trap. People who get bad luck, get some shocks that lead them to default. They're productive, but they have bad credit, which reduces their ability to find a job, increases the duration of their unemployment, and therefore reduces the rate at which their credit improves, and then adds persistence to the unemployment spell. So we have some people where we would say they are in a poverty trap, and yet they may still prefer to have an equilibrium, an environment where employers can check their credit. Okay, and so we're going to have general equilibrium in both labor and credit markets because we want to be able to capture this interaction when we do the policy. Okay. You used to have a little screen. I don't have time. I don't think so. Okay. Okay. So we're going to have two types here. Fraction pi I of each of these types, high and low. High is going to be the guy with patience. He's going to be the high productivity person in equilibrium, just to telegraph that for you. And we have a large number of employers, so I'll call these firms, and then lenders. Okay, so there are three basic agents in this model: workers, firms, and lenders. Okay, and so the way that we're going to build in the value of credit in a very parsimonious way is we're going to build in a smoothing motive by having sort of an early part of the month, late part of the month. You're going to want to consume throughout, but you're going to get paid at the end because you have to wait until you've produced to get paid. Okay, and so you're going to we're going to have two subperiods and consumption in both. And so again, workers differ in this inter-period discount factor. There's a survival rate that's just to keep everything stationary. And then we're going to have a period utility function that is linear in consumption in the two subperiods, but we have this reduced form way of trying to think about smoothing by essentially making people want to front load if there was no interest rate between the two subperiods. Okay, so this psi thing here is going to make you want to consume in the first subperiod if you can, and then we're going to have this utility from labor given by this z. So if you're not working, you get some additional utility because you get to hang out at home. Okay. The technology for production, you're going to work in the first subperiod, this NT. You're going to get the firm's going to get production from its workers. It's going to be dependent on the workers' human capital and whether or not they work. It's just going to be the product of those two things. Unemployed workers and vacant firms are going to match with an aggregate matching function. So this is very much in the in the standard undirected search literature. The human capital here is going to be this once and for all choice between a low value and a high value when you're born, and it's going to be a util cost, phi h, for each person. And then lenders are going to be able to essentially borrow from some, deep-pocketed other not modeled agent in the economy, I'll say abroad, in the first subperiod. They're going to be able to make loans with that, and then they'll pay some intermediation cost times the real interest rate in the second subperiod for what they borrow to lend to the agents in the economy.
And the rate or the omega depends on the credit history?
I couldn't hear you.
No, I'm just asking. And the rate, the R or the omega depends on the credit history, I guess, right?
No. So omega and R are what the lenders, what they have to pay. So this is like a risk-free rate plus an intermediation markup. So their lenders. What you want is coming. Yeah. So the household's going to borrow from the lenders, and that will have.
They'd be cautious. I'd say the lenders themselves would be cautious. Never mind, what they would give and what they would offer for some loans, depending on credit history, right?
I don't know if it's this thing, but I can't hear. There's like a noise that makes it where I can't.
No. I'm just saying it seems like both sides of the market would be affected, right? I mean, what the lenders would give, the terms at which, so the lender offer would depend on the kind of.
Yeah. So the lenders will offer terms for contracts, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the lenders get the resources from somewhere else. That's all I'm saying there. And the lenders pay a risk-free rate for those resources. Yeah, sorry.
So as you go along with your model, can you just point out where in the model you differ from what has been set up before in this theoretical?
Okay, so we're getting there.
Yeah, just highlight that then for
Yeah.
those who are not familiar with that literature.
Okay. So what's kept for a worker in terms of what information is observed when they either go to take out a loan or when they go to look for a job is going to come from what we're calling a record-keeping technology, and what's going to be recorded are your defaults, okay? So all I keep track of is 0, 1s, entire history of those things for you, whether you defaulted or not, okay? That we're going to summarize by a score. So this is all very similar to what Dean has done with Chatterjee and Rios rule in other work. This part is. So summarized by a score, which is the prior on you being a patient type, a type with high productivity and a high discount factor. And that is going to be observed by both lenders and employers, and except when we have the law ban it, in which case employers will not be able to observe it. Lenders will always be able to observe the history.
Is it relevant? Does it matter that it's free to observe it?
We just have to put restrictions on parameters so that people would want to, yeah. But yeah, here it's free. Okay. So the labor market here is so firms before they match with you, they observe. They can condition on your score, but they do not observe your type, your discount factor, or your human capital until after you're hired. So this is what I was saying to Jim, that that is going to be that uncertainty is going to be resolved immediately here. Okay. I and H are perfectly revealed once you're matched, and then you start bargaining. The whole reason for this is because bargaining under private information is just a problem that we don't know a very tractable solution to. This makes this part extremely easy. And in the credit market, lenders just never observe your true type or anything that would let them fully infer your true type. Okay, so it's always private information in the credit market.
Can I just ask once more, because this is about hiring, but as the employment continues, employers can update their beliefs. They do see your type reveals over time.
Yeah, they update immediately, completely. So the moment I hire you, you come in and you start working, and I stand over your shoulder and I say, high productivity person.
But if I see somebody who's been employed for a really long spell, does the next employer then have information that they're maybe a very productive worker? Or
they don't observe they don't observe their history of earnings. In our model, all matches have positive surplus, so all separations are exogenous. So just observing the length of an employment history would not allow you to infer that. Okay. Essentially, we have to make sure things can't be inverted to fully reveal. Okay. So unemployed worker is not super interesting. They get flow utility Z. The one thing I want to point out is that because ex ante, the surplus depends on the worker's credit, this is where the firms are going to want to post vacancies that condition on the credit history. Okay, so it is it is true that after the fact I'm going to know your productivity, but because that's going to determine this match surplus, I still care about your score even at that point. And before, I want to try to screen the productive from the unproductive. So when I post a vacancy, it will be specify the score of the workers that can apply to that job. Okay, that's how we're going to model employer credit checks, by saying these vacancies can be applied to by workers with this score, and there's a continuum of scores, and so we're going to have a continuum of vacancies posted in equilibrium.
I might have missed it. Just to clarify, also, is your employment history a signal? The fact that you are unemployed, is it a signal about your type? So when employers try to hire you, so you have the credit score, but
we don't. No, that's not there. That could be informative if I see.
Yeah, because you do see in the data that you get penalty from from unemployment, and there is a question of adverse selection.
The logic here is essentially that the nice thing about credit history is that there's a third party who's collecting it, so you don't have to worry about how credible. Like, I ask you, how long have you been unemployed? You can always, lie on your CV to some extent. So, but you're right. If we allowed them to see an unemployment spell duration, that could be another signal that we would put like S, U there or something. Yeah, we don't do it. Okay. Oh, for simplicity, we have unemployed households not borrowing. Okay, so there's no score updating while you're unemployed. The model is sort of computationally intensive as it is, so we want it to have as few credit contracting problems as we could possibly have, and this does that. So when you're unemployed, if you find a job, you start the next period employed. Your employer will know your productivity, and you start borrowing in order to smooth out consumption. When you're unemployed, you get this flow utility from leisure. You have no access to resources, so you can't borrow. You just sit there and have your leisure.
So what's the asset market besides this though? So you have this borrowing and lending, but do you have any savings so they can tide themselves over?
We're going to put parameter restrictions so that they choose not to save. We have the linear utility, so we can do that very easily. But yeah, there's no savings.
I think there'd be a strong motive for borrowing exactly during the period of unemployment. I mean, during the period of unemployment, they don't have any money, so.
Yeah, but I'll just say there's no savings, but we have a restriction so that they choose not to save. But I'll just leave it at that. But it's not too hard to get that restriction in this model because of the linearity of preferences. That does help us with that. Okay. Otherwise, we'd have to do more work to get that restriction. Okay. So here's where all the action actually is. It's the employed worker. Okay. So the way that an employed worker interacts with their employer is that they start with their state, their type, their human capital, which they determined way back when they were first born, and their credit score. Okay. Again, their employer knows their type, they know their credit score, they know their human capital. So here, when they come into work, they bargain over their earnings with their employer under full information. Okay. And because they're employed, they're going to work one. That means they don't get any of their utility from leisure. And then here's where one of the novel features of this model is how we model the credit market. Okay, and so this gets at Jim's question as well, because the lenders will have terms that depend both on the score, but also potentially by your reported type. Okay, so we're going to have what will look like a mechanism design problem with a revelation in this model. So these contracts will depend on the score of the worker who comes and tries to take a contract, but also will have type, indexed by type. So a low type and a high type credit contract. The way that you read these credit contracts is a little bit different than a lot of papers on unsecured credit. We read this as big Q is how much is delivered to you in the first subperiod. And so that's how much you eat in the first subperiod before you get paid. Little b is how much you promise to repay in the event that you repay. So it's a 0-1 decision in the second subperiod. You either repay or you don't. If you repay, you pay your promise, little b. Okay? So your contracts are fundamentally nonlinear in the sense that they have an amount delivered and an amount to be repaid.
So you're assuming that lenders can elicit type declarations, but employers cannot?
Employers cannot ex ante. Afterwards, they know.
What makes them different? I mean, the obvious thing is that employers can backdoor contracts and make workers truthfully reveal who they are. It's simple. You're assuming that they can.
Yeah. So
But
the
what is it about the
fundamentally,
technology that vendors have in terms of eliciting information?
well, the lending is static, so there's no need for the commitment problem is all on the borrower in the credit market. Essentially, you could think of why we don't have that in the labor market is because we're assuming that firms can't commit to contracts. So we have this period by period renegotiation.
But the firms are posting in score-specific markets, so they are making a commitment of some sort, right? It's to say, if you don't have this score, I've committed not to hire you, even though I just met you through this frictional search technology.
Yeah. So I will.
Yeah, but fine. So
Yeah. So I will say that the mechanics are there's no ability to write contracts that commit intertemporally, but statically there is. That's essentially the assumption that buys this. Yeah. Okay. So in the second subperiod, you receive your earnings as a worker, and that's what you bargained over. The way that we're going to get shocks that drive default here is through an expenditure shock. So there's going to be some probability that you get a shock and some probability that you don't get a shock at all, some probability that you do, in which case you draw it from a nice continuous CDF. Your default choice is once again a discrete choice. If you default, then you forego paying your debt and you avoid paying whatever these expenditure costs were. And so your consumption is always just going to be your earnings less the amount that you repay. So if D is 0, you repay everything. If it's 1, you repay none of it. And then you continue on exogenous separations, and your score updates based on whether or not you repaid or you didn't today and what your score was yesterday. So this is going to be a Bayesian updating function that maps current scores into future scores based on outcomes. Okay, so let me just say that that the thing that made this that makes this model it's still not the most tractable model in the world, but there's at least hope for this because we're using this extensive form game for the credit market from Netzer and Scheuer, an IER from 2013. Okay, and so this is going to essentially give us a nice nonlinear programming problem to solve for these contracts. So you could think of it as a game that lenders play against one another, where they start off by posting menus of contracts. So these menus have an amount that they're going to deliver, an amount that the borrower promises to repay, and because we have two types, there are going to be two elements in each menu. Okay. Lenders are then going to observe all the menus that every other lender has posted, as well as be able to infer which borrowers would take which ones. And then they can decide whether or not to stay and fulfill whatever the demand is for their menus, or to withdraw their menus altogether at some cost K. Okay? So they get that as a reputation cost or administrative cost that they have to pay. And then workers finally, when all the contracts they're going to be in the market or still in the market, they choose what they want. And so what you can show is that when lenders play this game, if you take the limit of equilibria as K goes to 0, so there's a positive cost, but it tends to 0, then you select a unique, robust subgame perfect equilibrium. And more importantly for us, it solves, and I'll get to that problem in just a second, it solves what looks like a mechanism design problem that's quite tractable. Okay. Okay, firms are kind of standard Morris and Pisaridi style, except that their vacancies condition on score. And again, the bargaining is under full information. So equilibrium is standard. The human capital choice is the first thing you do as a worker. We have value functions that depend on worker type and human capital, as well as their credit score. We have default decisions. That's really the worker's main choice that they have direct control over. The credit contracts that lenders post which end up being indexed by by worker type, and yeah, everything else is standard. Okay. Here's the human capital decision, which again, I apologize that this is a conference about human capital, and I will say our human capital choice could definitely be a bit livelier. So, but the idea here is that when you're born, you start off unemployed. You know what the expected discounted value of human capital is for you based on your patients. And so when you make this decision, you have some constant marginal cost per unit of human capital and some discounted expected utility, where when you're born with the population prior of being a good type. So this is sort of everyone's credit score starts off at the population share of patient types. So everybody can calculate this UIH and determine whether they want to make the investment or not. Okay. And so we will choose a parameterization where patient types choose to invest, and impatient types choose not to invest, so that we have this distinction between patient workers being productive and impatient being unproductive. This is just algebra. Let me show you what keeps you from defaulting. Okay. So when you've taken out a credit contract, you're sitting there, you're employed. So you know what your continuation utility is going to be if you default on this contract or if you repay it. Okay? You know that as you would expect, and it's true in equilibrium, it's going to be higher if you repay than if you default. Okay, that is true, and we'll show it. And so, in addition, we assume that there are some direct financial costs to default. Those need to be there to avoid, essentially complete unraveling of the credit markets. But these show you how big the dynamic endogenous costs of default are in this model. So essentially, this is for the patient type, and it depends on your credit score. Specifically, if your credit score is at 0 or 1, then no matter what you do, it's not going to change anyone's beliefs about which type you are. So in those cases, there's no endogenous incentive to repay. It's only exogenous. However, as your score becomes interior, what you do will update what people think you are. And the more patient you are, the more you care about that, because the more you care about that difference in the discounted in the continuation values. So in this calibration, we have relatively small differences in the discount factors, but of course these things add up pretty quickly, so that the patient type has a much, much higher incentive to repay than the impatient type. Okay? And trying to get this, sort of the profile over credit scores, is one of the big challenges actually in matching it to data, and I'll show you exactly how we do that in just a second. Okay? So again, the endogenous part, the level and shape, depend on the discount factor, and that's going to drive the relative default rates by credit score. That's going to be a central part of our calibration. These are just definitions. If you want to see some nice little algebra tricks for solving these models, we have them in the paper. Okay, an important part of this, and rather than show you equations, let me show you what these isoprofit and indifference curves look like. So the way to think about this contracting model is to imagine drawing isoprofits and indifference curves in the space of promised repayment, which we'll call debt, and credit, which we'll call Q. Okay? So credit, that's how much I give you. Debt, that's how much you promise to repay. The ratio is like the interest rate. Okay? So the green line here shows the zero profit curve for lending to an impatient household. So if I knew you were an impatient household, I could calculate your repayment probability for every unit of debt. I can calculate the most I could deliver to you as credit and break even. Okay? So it has this Laffer-like shape because eventually you get to a point where their probability of repayment starts declining rapidly, and you know there's some maximal amount where they would never repay it, in which case you can't deliver any credit to them. Furthermore, because of the difference in discount factors, you know that the inpatient guy's zero profit curve is flatter everywhere than the patient guy's. Okay, so there's sort of this monotonicity in profits on a contract basis by type. If I fix the contract terms, I'm going to make more profits if a patient guy takes that contract. So that's this blue curve here. Furthermore, because of the discounted expected utility, we know that the indifference curves also have this shape, so that the patient household's indifference curve is steeper everywhere than the inpatient households. So we have a single crossing property. So under full information, we would have more debt and credit delivered to the patient household, less to the inpatient. However, we have this private information, this adverse selection problem, using Netzer and Scheuer's contracting problem, which if you've ever done mechanism design, it's essentially what this is with a couple of added bits. We know that the equilibrium credit contracts are going to have one of two flavors. This is what we would call a least cost separating equilibrium, where the inpatient household is at their full information, and the patient household is being constrained in order to keep the inpatient household indifferent. And this is a novel feature from this equilibrium concept. This is not there in a lot of other equilibrium concepts. We can have cross-subsidizing contracts. So an important part of getting these cross-subsidizing contracts for matching to the data is that if we have least cost separating, then we don't see a change in interest rates as we vary the credit score. Okay? The terms are essentially just fixed here. When we have cross-subsidizing, we do see declining interest rates with credit score. And that's because as the credit score improves, more of the borrowers are the patient type, they have a higher repayment rate, and therefore we have a better mix, less cross-subsidizing to the inpatient type, and we have a declining interest rate. So this credit contracting problem that we've implemented has been important for matching the gradient of interest rates with credit scores.
So just confused, is it important to existence of equilibrium? Or
So you need something to ensure existence here. So there are other equilibrium concepts that could get existence. So Guerrier-Scheimer-Wright would get you existence, but it would keep you at the least cost separating. So this Netzer-Scheuer game is nice because it gets existence, it guarantees existence, and it has a marginally nicer contracting problem than what we would have gotten under Guerrier-Scheimer-Wright. But for us, it's important that we want this cross-subsidizing.
To match the data. That's why it's
to match the
important.
data.
Okay, and so let me actually get to a couple of results because I think I'm almost out of time. Existence here, I still have 10 minutes? Oh. Okay, well still let me get to some cool stuff. Okay, so this is what we're going to do here. We're going to take a bunch of parameters. In some ways, it's a very complicated model to write down, but it's not that complicated in terms of the number of parameters that we've introduced. So a lot of these we can just grab, essentially, from the literature. I will say that he already left, but this was my response to Jim, why we don't have savings. We set it so that the patient household's discount factor is 1 over the risk-free rate. And with the linearity, that means that they're indifferent between saving and not across periods. So that's the one thing that we're using a restriction on the theory to get a parameter there. Everything else here is pretty basic.
Sorry, I mean, maybe I don't understand. But if they're indifferent, how do you? What's the force that gets them to not? Surely, don't you want the difference to be like?
Okay.
Less.
Round one of those in just the right direction.
So
That's what I mean.
Less than.
Yeah. I'm going to set it equal, but I'm thinking of it as they're not going to save. That's what I mean. That's what
like the limiting case of all
yeah.
the.
You're choosing lambda to be equal to the full information post-use condition? Or
Yeah, this is the bargaining parameter. So we're going to set this so that if we had full information in the labor markets, so I know your type before matching, I could just post vacancies for patient, vacancies for inpatient. And so we're setting this so then that those vacancies would be determined according to the LCS condition. You see?
sometimes we set lambda because we want an efficient, initial situation, and so it's not that we think that there's anything natural about lambda taking that value, but at least we sort of have the nicety of working with an efficient economy. Mm-hmm. You don't have that here, right? Lambda equal to 0.5 doesn't give you efficiency.
So it gives us. If the way that we thought about it is if we take everything else as exogenous and just thought about the bargaining and vacancy creation, I think taking the value functions as given. You said taking all the.
It's not like your equilibrium is going to be efficient subject to this parameter.
Yeah, I think we want to compare everything to this equilibrium because it's sort of the closest we can think of to efficient. And yeah, we're open to doing other things here, but
some of the we like to kind of say how far away are we from this if there was full information to in equilibrium with full information, and so in that case it would be. I think in that case this Hosios condition would get us efficient allocation.
It'd be some kind of funny constrained efficiency because we still have the incompleteness in credit markets. It's like, that's what I'm trying to say. Subject to all of that incompleteness, would the vacancies be the efficient number of vacancies for each type under full information? That was the intuition for what we did.
It seems like even in the limited information case, for a constrained planner, if you give the planner the same information constraints, you might get the same. The lambda would still get you the right vacancy posting decision.
I'm not sure actually, but I think not. But yeah. Okay, so these are the internally calibrated parameters. So we need the fraction of each type. We need the discount factor of the inpatient person. We need the probability of getting these. And this is essentially the things that drive defaults. We need the probability of getting a shock in the first place. We need the cost of default. We need the intra-period discount factor. We need the low productivity workers' human capital relative to the high productivity, which we've normalized to 1. The cost of posting a vacancy, and a parameter on the shock, the draws from the shocks. And so these are just of course, these are all being targeted jointly. Like not one of these is giving me any one parameter, but we sort of listed these by when we move things around in the computer, which parameter moves which moment in a big way. Okay, so that's sort of why we listed them the way we did. So this is how it looks. So the thing that talking about this contracting environment that we think is kind of is cool here, that we create a distribution of scores, of type scores. We can then order those by where they are in the distribution and have a mapping to credit scores. Okay, so our S's are not literally credit scores, but credit scores are actually just an index of where you lie in the probability of default. So we can order everyone by their probability of default and create the equivalent of a credit score. And so then we can look at the average interest rate on debt for people with all of these credit scores. And let me just show you graphically. The model is getting kind of the endpoints for the very, very bad credit risk people, which I call super subprime. And the very good credit risk people, it's nailing those pretty well. The only thing that it kind of wants to do is create too steep of a difference between subprime and prime. I mean, we have two types, so everything here is being driven essentially by those endogenous hump things I showed you. That's what's driving different repayment rates across the score distribution. Okay, so that's what we're trying to get to get that hump, that endogenous cost of default, to try to discipline that. And so we're still working on it. I think we'll eventually be able to at least get it flat, if not literally right on top of those interest rates. So this is what the distribution looks like. So we define the credit rating so that we match exactly what the U.S. looks like in terms of credit ratings, in terms of the share of the population. So this is by definition the left-hand side. So we want to have a quarter of people in this super subprime and so forth, with about half of people who are in the super prime category. Of course, the model then has a prediction about which type is in which credit rating bracket, which is not directly observable in the data, but it's still kind of interesting to look at. And as you might expect, our impatient types, they're the very subprime people. Our patient people, they're the ones who are super prime. Okay. And so here's our job finding rates, and again, we plot them relative to the full information. I'm going to show you this graph again, so let me just skip it. This is the updating function, and this tells you essentially why we have this separation in the stationary distribution. So essentially, people are repaying almost all the time, okay? And so if I see you repay, it's not incredibly informative of your type. So this is not the 45, but you could be forgiven for thinking it was. It looks very much like the 45-degree line. So when you repay, I barely update your score at all. When you default, however, it's quite informative. So observing a default really pulls your credit score downward. Okay, and so that's why, because impatient types are much more likely to default, they are clustered over here with low scores, and patient types are very unlikely to default. They're clustered with high scores. It's sort of a shame because we did all this hard work to have private information, and then in the stationary distribution, there actually is very little because people just kind of move endogenously where they should be. Let me just say, relative to full information, I had said this idea of a poverty trap, and here's one way of trying to explain that. I can think about the average unemployment duration for the patient types. These are the people for whom there's a mistake being made. They should be finding jobs, and then they would pay their debt down. So it's like, we want these people to get access to credit, to have jobs. And so under full information, their average unemployment duration would be about 3.5 weeks. The median of these people in our economy are unemployed for on average about 4 weeks, and the lowest decile for about 4.5 weeks. Okay, so these people here are in a poverty trap in a relatively big way. They're unemployed much longer than they would be under full information. And we kind of give you a sense there. But let me get to the experiment so you can see what happens when we ban the employer credit checks. Okay, so at the median, we get negative aggregate effects. Okay, so 50%, the person who's at the median credit score is on the margin and likely enough to be a patient type that when you ban employer credit checks, they experience a decline in their job finding rate. Okay, so this is bigger than what we were finding, or this is actually smaller than what we were finding in the data, but it's going in the right direction. It has some compositional effects on the labor market, but those turn out to be relatively small. Essentially, the people who have bad credit are less productive. They make up a bigger share of the employed pool, and so that pulls down labor productivity. Okay, just a little bit. What happens big time here in the model, this is bigger than than our estimates from the data, is that the default rate rises. Okay, essentially those dynamic incentives to repay, those big humps, those just become flat. And that makes it where people default more. Okay? So we did see that. We did see more delinquencies. It's maybe a little big here. Okay? That leads to the credit card interest rates going up and people taking out more debt. Let me show one last thing. Let me show these welfare numbers. So part of the idea here was to take some of this stuff that we see at least qualitatively happening in the data and build a model on top of it that can then be used to try to think about the distributional welfare effects. And we actually do see big heterogeneity in the welfare effects of the ban across worker types and employment statuses. So if we look at the patient workers, they turn out, essentially they're so patient that being employed or unemployed doesn't make much of a difference for them, but they end up losing on average across the score distribution. Okay, so if you took a patient person who was like the one person who was unlucky enough to have a really low credit score, they would gain, but on average, these guys all have high credit scores, and so they lose from the policy. Okay, their finding rates fall, and actually their credit markets worsen as well. The impatient types, however, end up gaining and enough to offset the patient losses. So especially unemployed impatient households, they on average have low credit scores before the policy, they have low job finding rates, the policy raises their job finding rates. And we're actually getting a number there that's pretty consistent with, where did that go? Here. So what we find is that if we look at the bottom 20% of the credit score distribution, the eliminating employer credit checks increases their reduces their unemployment duration by 24%. That's close to an empirical estimate from Friedberg, Hines, and Pattison that found a 25% reduction in unemployment duration for people who they identified as being, in the lowest 20%. It's not perfect, but it's at least in the ballpark. Okay, so that's what's driving these welfare gains. When you net them all out, it turns out to be, somewhat small, but there's quite a bit of heterogeneity there. And there it is over this course. So I'll just conclude. So we think that we should expect when there's a policy like this, where you're going to constrain information that's being used in a market, that it's going to have a distributional welfare effect. It certainly seems to have effects on outcomes. And so we tried to build here a model where we could evaluate that. In terms of outcomes, we see a rise in the job finding rates for people with bad credit, a fall for people with good credit. But something that I think very few people thought about when they thought about these laws is that it actually affects credit markets. There's a spillover into credit markets. And that's bigger in the model, but there's some evidence of that in the data as well. And we find large heterogeneity in welfare effects in the ways that you would imagine them. I think that number didn't get updated, but overall, we do find a gain. That said, that's because there's a lot of people who gain a lot, and a few people who gain a lot, and a lot of people who lose a little. So if you were to put this to a vote, we only get about 35% of the population gaining in the stationary distribution. Okay. Thanks.
Final question? That's one final question. So part of this, as you said, was about trying to inoculate your analysis to the Lucas critique and doing something where the credit markets were not policy invariant. Do you have a sense of how important that is at the end for your welfare calculation?
We tried to make that as small as we could with the linear preferences. So it's all coming from just whether you can front load it within the period. An earlier version of this, we had concavity. We had and there it was huge welfare losses coming from the credit market. So we tried to stack the cards against us there with the preferences that we used. But we can also, of course, do the decomposition, which we haven't done. But
thank you.
Okay, thanks.